GONKCAST, a long-form discussion podcast about the music of English electronic duo Autechre, album by album, EP by EP. I'm Gabe.
I'm Dan.
And this is yet another episode in our AE Revisited series, this time on Autechre's 2013 EP, Elevent. If you think about it, the last proper Autechre EP. Before we jump in, remember we've launched a Patreon where for just $5 a month, you'll get bi-weekly bonus episodes on AE adjacent music, plus the opportunity to vote on future bonus episode topics. Last week, for example, the patrons decided we should do an episode on the Field's hidden gem, arguably from 2013, Cupid's Head, one of my favorites. Dan, you weren't as hot on it, but it was still a fun episode, right?
Yeah, of course.
It left me in like kind of a techno mood all week. I was like, I might even have something to say about that when we get to like the new music recs at the end of the episode, but I was like really heavy in the techno mind frame. So head on over to patreon.com/GONKCAST. Join us for those. Shout out, by the way, to our newest patron, Grabaz. I feel like that's it's meant to be some dirty joke or something, but welcome. I want to mention we've got no bonus episode next week. Instead, we've got a special treat for everybody, a main episode, an interview with Shane Parrish about his new album, Autechre Guitar, which is like transcriptions of classic AE tracks for the acoustic guitar. I know it's been just hotly anticipated by the Autechre community. So I think that'll be really fun. Look out for that and send us your thoughts about Autechre Guitar. We might get to discuss those, which is out now, by the way, gonkcastpod@gmail.com. What do you think about it? After that, I think we'll do another bonus episode on something fun before getting back to our Autechre Revisited main episodes, but we'll keep you updated over on Patreon. So to get started, we like to talk about news, leftovers from last time, corrections. We didn't really have any news this week, but I wanted to shout out some YouTube comments, actually, on our XI Revisited episode. At Big Z Lilk 1150 over on YouTube said, "You guys are so wrong about Twin Horizon. This is AE doing Girl/Boy, the Aphex Twin song, without needing to use orchestral instruments. The groove holds it together while the hisses, pops, squeals, whistles, and beats create the perfect space for noise to be presented as pop music. The contrast between Twin Horizon and the ambient atmosphere of Blade Low-Res shows they are masters of sound." I ended up feeling bad. I don't know how you feel, Dan. I ended up feeling bad about Twin Horizon. That was like what I heard most was people were upset about. We were a little dismissive of it. I actually kind of really like this comp to that Girl Boy Aphex Twin song, which uses orchestral, instruments. This is kind of like Autechre's version of that kind of songwriting approach. Did you feel any guilt about that, Dan?
I never feel guilty. I'm perfect.
Okay. From same listener, we had asked, we had just sort of said, like, I don't think we have ever looked into the Autechre Boards of Canada connection. And so this Big Z Lil K, whatever, had jumped in saying, Sean was responsible for bringing Boards of Canada to the attention of Warp. He also has the best quote on Boards of Canada. When asked if he's heard from them or knows anything, he said he didn't know, hadn't heard, and wouldn't say even if he did. He then expanded on this by saying they are probably in the future wondering why it isn't like the past. I have like a vague memory. Maybe I did know that and I just forgot about it, but doesn't it feel like it's like kind of poetic, but also feels like a slight dig?
Yeah, a little bit. I like it, but yeah, it's a little bit of a dig. But also I feel like you understand exactly what he means.
Yeah, I know. It's funny. I'm sure he doesn't mean it as a dig because clearly there's a fandom
more of a
there,
razz.
But I just, it sort of like made me think about the fact that, Autechre is very forward looking, whereas Boards of Canada are kind of backwards looking, but interesting all the same. Another YouTube comment, really just trying to shout out the YouTube. I always forget to check the YouTube comments, but we are active over there, and we are reading. So StarMap SLLC over on YouTube said, XI is awesome, and you guys are right to mark it as the start of true new techer. That was kind of our theory. They also added, excited to hear you guys mention the prospect of a part-by-part LSEC revisit. It's one of my favorite albums ever. Yeah, we talked about, I think that would be the right way to do LSEC when we revisit it, is like actual segment by segment. I think that would be really rewarding.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're in no hurry now, waiting for these new sets to drop, and then after that, who knows what. So, I think we definitely take it part by part.
Yeah, and we talked last time about doing Chorustus next or soon. Listener Joe had written in to say something similar, like, please do that part by part. That I'm a little bit more like, I'm torn on how exactly to do that, because it feels like we should do the main album, but then it's like, it gets redundant if we do, a whole episode on versions, then a whole episode on the Quadrange EP. Like, these are like literally different versions of each other, but there's got to be some way to take that piece by piece as well.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I like my gut reaction is to do it piece by piece. But yeah, there is a lot of redundancy, and then also, even with the redundancy, at the third episode, I'm not going to remember what I said. The first episode of the series, it's going to be hard. So yeah, we gotta figure that out, but we got time.
Yeah, we will. All right, that's all the upfront stuff. We ready to dive into Elevent, Dan?
Let's do it. Little bit of background. As we discussed last time, Autechre conceived of XI as, quote, a box of 4 12 inches and the accompanying Elevent EP as interchangeable with any of the 12 inches in XI. However, some of their other comments make Elevent sound more like outtakes from the sessions. Sean has said that XI was compiled as a series of 12-inch records and Elevent was the one that didn't fit in. So that became a separate entity. And Rob described it as a little bit more rude, a little more aggressive, adding that an EP gives you shorter exposure time, so you're able to hit people with slightly more extreme stuff and not take too much of a toll on anyone. Also, when asked back in 2013 if they ever feel the urge to release a lot more than you do, Sean replied hilariously, given what would come next, yeah, we can't release everything. Even 2.5 hours is too much for busy people.
I guess they just stopped giving a shit about that at all. But according to Sean, Elevent was intended to come out before XI. I feel like that's significant. We'll talk about it. But Warp Records flipped the release order. I also feel obligated to mention Sean's comment about the optimal way to listen to each track on the EP for the first time when he was asked about this. On good headphones, he says, but also for track 1, a roller coaster, track 2, a ghost train, track 3, a maze of mirrors, and track 4, the beach. Weirdly, those kind of work really well.
Did you try it out? Did you go to the theme park? I don't really know where you go to a ghost train, but
I haven't. But it's such a he's clearly joking, but it's spot on. I feel like he actually gave it some thought. Anyway, to dive in with our high level thoughts up front, Dan, how did you feel about Elevent before revisiting this past week?
I think I said on our original episode back in the day, this has always been an EP I like and one I grab to listen to a lot of times because it is only 26 minutes. Like sometimes you want just a little sampling of XI, but like Rob said, you're busy people. You don't have 2.5 hours, but it's much easier to fit in 26 minutes. So Elevent, I think, is one of the EPs I listen to more frequently than the others.
Me too. I feel like this is underrated, honestly. I think it is a great, as we'll talk about it, it's a great little story in short form. It kind of has a nice flow, a nice arc. It, feels like a little bit more XI, and XI is one of my favorite records ever. And I have frankly listened to it a little bit too much, so there are a lot of times where I want this and it's nice to have a kind of bite-sized version that I haven't overplayed as much. And so I feel like I often go to Elevent when I'm in an XI mood, ironically, you know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I do basically the same thing, a lot of some of the best EPs, work that way. But EPs are generally for fans of a band,
Mm-hmm.
and they're great when it is something like, I've listened to this, this band so many times, but you just want a little taste or something, that when an EP could be like that, I think it's peak form of the format. And I think Elevent is a great example of that here.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think the conversation we have to have up front, right, is, as you kind of noted, there is some inconsistency in the way they talk about this record. They sometimes say that it's meant to be interchangeable with any of the, 4 EPs in the XI box, which we've also disputed. Like, is that totally serious or not? Sometimes it seems more like it's meant to be sort of additive, like you could kind of, some of our listeners wrote in to say like they tested really just adding it in somewhere or something. And yet other times they talk about it more like outtakes. I mean, they explicitly use this phrase like it didn't fit, which is really an important, like, revealing comment, because that tells us something, I think, crucial about what the goal of XI was supposed to be. Like, what is it about this that doesn't fit? So where are you kind of at on those two options? Like, is it meant to be part of XI in some way or not really? Where did you land on that?
Yeah, I was like trying to think like, where would I slot this in and stuff. And I don't know if it's like a function of just like knowing XI pretty well and, like changing anything about it, like, messes with your head or what. So I kind of like it as a separate thing. Also because like I said at the start, like I really do enjoy having just this like little bite-sized version of XI. And so I kind of like it being separate like that, thinking of it as extras. Like how they said it doesn't fit. I kind of like that more. It's like the extended version of XI. Bonus tracks for like people who want more.
Yeah, I kind of decided this week that I don't like and maybe don't even buy the idea that it is supposed to be part of XI. It feels like a thing apart to me. I experimented all week with like putting it different places, swapping it out for different sections of XI. Like you said, I can't tell if it's because I have listened to XI so much that it never, actually fits. You know what I mean? I'm like, I know XI like so well that it always sounds wrong. You
anticipate the next song and then it's different.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's that, but I also kind of feel like Elevent sounds a little different, even at like the mastering level. I think this sounds a lot clearer and more like high definition, whereas
I agree.
XI is very murky. It's like very dirty. I honestly was thinking, I don't think we talked last week, but I was realizing that XI is kind of like the start of murky AE. A lot of people associate them with like perfection. I mean, you listen to like LP5, it just sounds so clean and perfect. Whereas I see people complaining, and I honestly understand, but people complain about like the 2022 Dash stuff, saying that it's murky, that it's poorly mixed, that it sounds like a live mix, and that's because it is, but like that's maybe not what some people want from studio AE. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think XI is murky as hell, and Elevent is not, and yet at the same time it's also quite empty. You know what I mean? I think like that's the defining feature of Elevent, and actually that's what I was kind of hinting at earlier, is it kind of tells like it has a cool arc, because we start off quite abrasive, quite noisy, and then it almost feels like we get emptier and emptier as we go along the thing. That feels very different from XI for the most part.
Yeah, XI doesn't seem to have like, one overarching thing. I mean, we went into it in detail. Maybe each 12-inch does in some respect, which maybe lends to this being another one of those. But I agree. The mixing like sounds different than XI. Everything is like much clearer. I was thinking that a lot, especially we'll get into it more. But the second track. M39, yeah, Defain. Like that would, like, you can just hear so many little things, like little bits and pieces that, like, I feel like in XI proper, it would have been a lot more, murkier, a lot more like blended together.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think like, they're Oslo for N also gets very, very sparse as it goes along, as we'll discuss. So it just, I don't know if it's my head, but I kind of suspect it's not, that when you try to put it in the middle of XI, it really sticks out like a sore thumb, no matter where you put it. I did feel, like if I had to pick, I kind of like it coming first. It almost serves a similar function as the first quote unquote EP of XI, which kind of starts like as abrasive as possible and ends up on something quite pretty, quite dreamy. Actually, that's sort of the arc of Elevent. I almost think that it starts noisy, gets emptier and emptier, and then you almost replace that noise with now something kind of pretty, something more like melodic. So it has kind of this nice yin and yang thing from the first to the last track. But I wouldn't do that either.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, I think it plays best up front, but same. I don't know that I would want it to be there. It's just, if I had to.
Yeah. So the other thing that, really jumped out to me this week is I'm interested in the fact that they wanted to release this first. And instead it came out many months later. I'm sort of interested in like, why is that? Why did they want it to come first? And when I listen to Elevent, I kind of think of it as sounding a little bit more like it precedes XI than it comes after. You know what I mean? It almost sounds like, because they're sort of saying, all right, we put this together and this is the one that didn't fit. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? It didn't fit. And part of me thinks it's because it is so coherent. Like Elevent sounds so together. Whereas XI has this kind of hodgepodge quality. And so if you had this one stretch of songs that like really beautifully like worked all together, it wouldn't fit, So it almost made me think like this has some kind of preeminence to XI in that sense. Like it might even be the first batch that they put together, and then they sort of realized, damn, we can't find any other like super cohesive group like this one. You know what I mean? So I almost started thinking like these are not so much outtakes as it's like the prototype for XI. It's like maybe the first EP they put together, and then they realized we're not going to be able to be so cohesive. Let's actually lean into the all over the place, White Album-esque quality and just leave this apart. And in that sense, right, like Elevent, we should have heard it first. You kind of know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I was thinking about like, would it be better like had it come out first? I don't know. I think it's like a good appetizer for XI because we're leaning in that like new techer kind of direction. But like you said, this is cohesive XI. This sort of White Album, hodgepodge approach. So like, I wonder if it came out first, would people like then look at that like hodgepodgeness of XI as a negative, because you're getting pumped for XI by hearing Elevent. You're like, oh, they made this little, suite of 4 songs, or what's it going to be like when it's 16 or whatever
yeah,
it's on,
right.
I don't think that like physically actually changes anything. Just, like the initial reaction and stuff, I think may have been like a bit more mixed because of that. But also, I mean, Autechre is obviously a band that like people don't expect like the same thing over and over from. So maybe it wouldn't matter too much.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, and I also started thinking about, a couple of our listeners pointed this out as well, but clearly LSEC is them in some ways executing some of the stuff that they initially thought of here on XI. LSEC is actually 5 separate, not EPs in that case, like almost full album length things, but they have a little bit more separation between them, a little bit more identity. I think, listener Joe, I think, says this specifically. I'll get to his email in a minute, but I found myself thinking back to LSEC 1. And do you remember when we talked about LSEC 1? And this is why it'd be so fun to revisit it, but we talked about LSEC 1 having this almost like sampler plate function where it doesn't actually hang together that well, but like each track feels like a kind of preview of stuff that they are then going to dig way deeper into like on a future LSEC installment. And in that respect, it makes me think of maybe that's what Elevent is it is meant to be the sampler plate before the main meal of XI. And it's like part of the reason Elevent is a little bit overlooked is because we actually got it in the wrong order.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because I do remember saying that in the original podcast, and I mean I think I still think it for the most part. So yeah, you may be right.
The other thing I wanted to bring up front here is I found myself kind of struck listening to this, and another reason why I almost think of it as like a prototype of the XI style is there are little glimmers on some of these tracks of like, and we'll talk about it when we get there, but it reminds me of almost like early Autechre track construction. I found myself thinking a lot about Envain EP, which is the other EP on this Revisited series that we did like a full episode on just an EP. And I thought that was really actually fun because I like paid so much more attention to it than I normally would. And I just sort of noticed that on, like the first track, Tack Laora, M39 Defain is kind of a similar thing. They have like quite clear, A part, B part, and it kind of goes back and forth. Whereas a lot of the XI tracks are more, they're like more evolving, kind of oozing, morphing over the course of the thing. These reminded me of some of like the kind of classic AE, like Envain style, tri-repete style track constructions where it's like A part, B part, A part, B part, and then like, by the end we have all the parts playing simultaneously or something. I just thought that was interesting. And honestly, I think the reason why it really stuck out to me is because I've been listening a lot to the Shane Parrish Autechre guitar record. And, it just sort of brings to the fore, like their melodic construction, how there's usually some melody and then there's another melody that almost sounds totally separate, but then they come together at the end and you realize like how beautifully interlocking they are. There's like a little bit of that here, which I almost view like in retrospect as a little bit of a throwback Autechre style. Did you get any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I thought of this. I was thinking, XI is sort of like the beginning of this like jam band version of Autechre. And these tracks, these four, like none of them really seem like too jammy. Maybe the first one a bit, which, we'll talk about. But I think like, they're much more like constructed in that classic sense than most of XI is, which I think is another reason it doesn't quite fit in.
Yeah, I think of them as like more composed than jammy sounding. Especially, I mean, you mentioned the first one, Tack Laora, but I feel like that feels quite composed, like because it has a clear start and then it sort of reaches like an outro part. I kind of think like Oslo for N feels a little jammy or something, but yeah, we'll get into it. I can tell like we're kind of rearing to like dive in, but we got a lot of write-ins about this EP, which I'm like, I don't know, I'm like hyped about because I feel like it doesn't often get like that kind of star treatment. So let's kind of go back and forth on some of these like big picture write-ins so we can get this all on the table. EBCD, I'll start with, said, I'd argue these four tracks are better than some of the weaker tracks on XI itself. I've only ever really listened to XI as a complete product that doesn't need anything added, and trying to choose a place to slide Elevent in is a tough call to make. It's hard to imagine any of the closers on XI transitioning well into Tack Laora, and also hard to imagine Newbound leading well into any of the openers of each 12-inch. The possibility of swapping out one of XI's discs for Elevent has also been proposed, in which case I would personally switch out disc 2. That's probably some kind of sacrilege as it means cutting blade low res, but frankly, I would already probably be tempted to cut Vec OS and Flep even without new tracks to replace them, which is kind of harsh, but as I said, I think Elevent offers some stronger highlights than some of what XI has to offer. See, I was kind of feeling like, actually, if you swap out disc 1, Elevent has a lot in common with the very noisy Vec OS and Flep, and it feels like quite a nice, smooth transition there. But you want to read Joe's?
Yeah, Joe says, I recently rewrote the Wikipedia article for Elevent. In doing so, I read through virtually all the professional reviews from the time, and there are two major consensus conclusions that popped up. The first is that the EP is darker and edgier than the material on XI. Given how gritty and dark, especially the second half of XI is, SPL 9 in particular, I guess I don't really hear this, but I'm curious to hear what you guys have to say. The second was that this material, as well as the XI stuff in general, was a bit of a retread of their previous work. Personally, XI and Elevent sound like a totally different path than almost anything they've done previously, and definitely nothing like the preceding 4 or 5 albums.
Yeah, that to me sounds insane. Like that this feels like a retread. I don't know what the hell they would be talking about. But as far as the first comment, would you describe this as like darker and grittier than, edgier than XI proper?
I mean, what was it? Sean or Rob, one of them, we read the quote where he said, it's like a little bit more rude and aggressive and stuff. I definitely get that on the first track, that one kind of comes out the gate at you. Oslo for N, the cough kind of can maybe have that. But I think like maybe darker in the sense of like we were talking about, like this empty space and all. But I don't know that like without those quotes from whoever it was, Rob or Sean, that I would like immediately go there. I don't get like, real, oh, this is an obviously dark record. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I think people describe XI as being quite a dark record itself. It's kind of what Joe is alluding to. And even that, I'm a little bit like, I think we're being sort of conditioned by the way the way the record starts, frankly. There are some crazy
and
like
the cover,
SPL9 and stuff. Yeah, and the cover for sure, right? We actually talked about that when we did the Field Cupid's Head last week. It's like everybody described it as darker. All journalists jumped on, and it's like, are we sure it is, or are we just saying that because the cover is suddenly black? It really can have an influence. But I also think, starting with something so destroyed as like Floor, it makes you think like, oh, this is really an abrasive record. I don't know if that's exactly true. And I almost feel like the same thing happens again on Elevent, which is, Tack Laora is quite abrasive. I do feel like overall it feels less musical. Like there's not a lot of melody here. And yet the last track's like a full fourth of this thing is extremely melodic. So it also kind of reminds me of the Field, where it's like, all right, when we talk about this whole thing is abrasive, I mean, at least 25% is very pretty. So I don't know if that's true. I want to read from Rob next, who says, I always feel like I'm unfair on Elevent as I compare it to XI too much, and it's just too different a vibe. As XI is one of my favorite Autechre albums, I guess my issue is that I was led to believe that Elevent could realistically be considered interchangeable with the rest of XI, and that simply isn't the case. Yes, you can hear that similar programming lies behind them both, but Elevent is radically different in how abstract it is. My issue is the same as I have with their set A's from the 2022 Dash project. I rarely find myself in the mood to listen to it.
Tyler says the record is short enough that it doesn't overly frustrate me to deal with it, but it's something I rarely return to. It feels pretty directionless, uninspired, and unsatisfying. If Gabe's theory about XI is correct, that it was an album documenting Autechre's process of wrangling a new system into their control, this EP feels like the primordial soup that they were yet to master. Ultimately, the tracks feel like throwaway B-sides. I struggle to see how this would fit anywhere on XI without massively screwing up the flow.
So quite negative, but I mean, I feel like, I don't agree with the hate for it, but I think we're on the same page, Tyler, where it's like, it does feel like a pre-XI. Like it's not, it's the half step before XI. And for me, that's like kind of what makes it like a cool standing apart thing, but I get why you're saying that. I want to read this from listener Joe again, who we heard from just a second ago, who says, in terms of XI plus Elevent working as a set of 5 distinct EPs, I think that although that might have been the original concept, I don't think that's what we ended up with. Although XI works amazingly as a double CD and works fairly well as 2 individual discs start to finish, at the end of the day, it's a bit of a stretch to imagine these as complete products aside from Elevent, which was actually released that way. I do think, though, that this original idea was the inspiration for LSEC, which really is a group of 5 separate similar length releases, each with its own identity to some extent. Yeah, I wanted to shout out Joe on that because that's what kind of got me thinking in these terms, as I said earlier.
So Neil says, I don't agree that XI and Elevent work as 5 interchangeable EPs. First, in terms of quality, Elevent is good, but I don't think it meets the level of any of the 4 quarters of XI. In terms of character, most of Elevent is colder, less dividing, and more abstract. In some ways, it sounds like a midway point between XI and LSEC. In other ways, it seems to be returning to more Confield-like approach, especially tracks like Bind and Parallelic Triangle that create a visceral experience where sounds seem to describe physical objects or events, and traditional musical structures are secondary.
That's a nice pull, actually. Yeah, it does have that kind of like, it's just the audio version of like some 3D object they constructed, like Confield draft kind of style. Listener Marcy said, I tried all the different combinations, and I think the best spot would be right in the middle between Blade Low Res and 1-1 is. So we're not interchanging here. We're like just figuring out a place to add it. The Blade Low Res to Tack Laora transition goes hard as hell, and Newbound to 1-1 works quite decently as well. I definitely wouldn't put this at the very end because YJY really is the perfect closer for the whole thing. Also, I hope you guys can see the little goblin face on the right side of the cover art too. I do actually think both XI and Elevent have like a little, if you look at it a certain way, it like looks like a little cutesy, emoji face or something.
Yeah, I definitely see it. Jackson says, revisiting the EP, I realize the transitions between tracks are smoother than some of the transitions on XI itself. I think it holds up on its own and offers a good bit of variety.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we're saying. Like, it feels like this kind of fits together in a way that actually XI strategically doesn't. But let's jump in to the first track. It's called Tack Laora. Again, we got a lot of stuff that I want to just put out on the table up front. First, I want to read these notes from AE Pages, which explains Tack Laora was edited down by Sean within a week with the original live jam recorded a few months earlier. So that's so interesting to me because like we were kind of saying a minute ago, although you seem to be on the other side, I was just feeling like this doesn't feel like a jam to me, but it apparently started as one.
That's why I said it because of the comment,
Yeah, another comment from AE Pages. Much of the track's dynamics were achieved in real time with mostly envelopes changing according to conditions and a ton of bus compression. I also wanted to read this comment from an Ask Autechre Anything, which I had actually missed, but listener Marcy pointed this out. Sean had said, I had a guy around fixing my boiler a couple of years ago when I was doing Tack Laora. So I played him that because he was asking. He just said, who listens to this then? Loads of guys sitting in their houses smoking weed. And I went, yeah, pretty much. Very revealing. It sounds like something you would make when somebody's working on your boiler. You know what I mean? Like maybe it has that kind of vibe. All right, to get the listeners on the table, listener Sunil had this to say about Tack Laora. The sound design is next level captivating. It's hard and grimy, but fluid and slippery. It makes me think of something like a giant metallic snake lumbering and slithering, leaving behind trails of oily slime. It seems to share some DNA with Fluor, Prac F, and especially Feed 1. The part where it falls into a fixed loop around halfway through reminds me of 1-1 is.
Marcy says, simultaneously one of their most satisfying and frustrating tracks. That minute from 50 seconds to 2 minutes is so unbelievably satisfying and catchy, it just scratches something in my brain that I didn't know I needed. But then that part is over, and I'm just left wanting more because that part completely overshadows the rest of the song for me.
Listener Jackson said, this one scratches an itch in my brain. That's so funny that both Marcy and Jackson said the same thing. It's super noisy in a way that at times feels somehow more grating than actual pure noise music. I like how the noisy stuff glitches around on top those wispy percussive sounds. Yeah, that, I think it was Rob earlier, had compared this to Set A. That feels like very, very Set A.
EBCD says, definitely fun to listen to, just on the basis of it being a rare instance of Autechre seemingly going all out on the chaos and noise. A really fun track just for how uncompromising and sloppy it is, particularly in its mid-segment with all these frenzied and discordant bass tones. I also enjoy the way the track sounds as if it gradually decays in its last leg, as the overall fidelity of the sounds seem to worsen, like it's slowly crossfading into the murkiest and most poorly compressed MP3 you can imagine. I particularly enjoy the nasty shrieks and whines towards the end that sort of resembles the artifacts that you would hear in audio files with extremely low bit rates. That all being said, I do think it's very hard for me to ignore the first minute or so of the track, as I cannot get over how much it sounds like someone ripping the hardest ass I've ever heard. Literally just sounds like toilet music. I'm sorry if this ruins the track for anyone, but it's something I feel has to be addressed.
Yes,
I hadn't read that one before reading it live there. So
yeah, and then finally, listener Tyler said simply piercing, buzzy, and chaotic. So, what do you think of Tack Laora?
Well, I don't agree that it sounds like toilet music as much as I do like that. Yeah, I mean, I think all the listeners were right on the mark, and like it's just this like chewed up, metallic, like I feel like this is what people who don't like Autechre think Autechre sounds like. It's just like stuff's flipping around your head, like that the end that the listener talked about. Like I really love that, how it does do that, like sort of it's like a digital Basinski, it's getting to like compressed audio, and then those low bit rate, like where it's just like the like Lucier, like just the barest bones left of the music. I really enjoy that. This one does like remind me quite a bit of like what I remember like set E and stuff feeling like, you know, just like the energy and like chaoticness of it.
Yeah, I love this track. I think it's like absolute banger. I love what Sunil said, where it's like simultaneously hard and grimy, but also fluid and slippery. I mean, it makes me think of like, you know, like these lava lamp, like bursts of like these kind of bubbles or something, like just big, squishy, buzzy, you know, sounds. And yeah, it's so chaotic and aggressive. But then, like I was saying, it's almost like the A part is quite off balance, quite like chaotic. And then it shifts to a B part, which is like a slightly more like a steadier kind of like a descending, kind of a bass riff, honestly. And I feel like this is what, Marcy was talking about when they said that, that minute from like 50 seconds to 2 minutes is like so good. It's like, I agree. It's my favorite part of the track. It's like, it kind of locks into steadier territory, but then it shifts back to the A part, which is again, like a chaotic, explosive. And then when it switches back to B, like you were saying, it feels almost like each switch takes some kind of toll on the track, and it gets hollowed out, like each, you know, each switch back and forth to the end where it sounds really empty and hollow again. Like I like, you know, what Sunil said, it's like some giant metallic snake lumbering and slithering, but then it's like by the end we can just hear like the snake skin or something to kind of build on that analogy, right? I also like, though, on that kind of B part, it has this really springy buzzing quality that reminds me of one of my all-time favorite tracks on NTS sessions, that of, you know, Violvoik from NTS2. I think like just the, you know, craziest door stopper you've ever heard. It's like a little bit of a prototype for that. I love every single second of this thing.
One of my favorite moments, it's around like 3 minutes and 20 seconds or so. Like we're going, and then like the whole song like stops for like a beat or two. It's like the quickest false ending. It almost feels like somebody fucked up for a second, you know, or something. I just love like the way that's like thrown in there.
I'm glad you mentioned that, actually, because that was another like kind of almost old school Autechre thing that I noticed a couple times on this EP. Is, you remember we talked about this like when we did the Envain EP? I had forgotten, you know, it's just like the old kind of DJ trick, which is like throw in a pause, and then the drop will be really, you know, it hits really hard when everything kind of crashes back in. They weirdly do that a couple times on this record. And because it's so off balance and crazy, yeah, it sounds almost more like a skip or something, but I almost think of it as having that same kind of like, you know, it gives you that jolt of energy or that like thrill that just classic DJ tricks do. I honestly think, you know, we hear that again on a couple of the tracks, which I'll try to point out. But again, that had like kind of an old school feel. And then, yeah, I just wanted to make sure I mentioned the fact that it is interesting to learn that this was edited down from a jam, because to me, it sounds so like cohesive. It feels like it comes out the gate at full speed, and then it kind of like gets hollowed out. And then we kind of end with a proper outro in which this kind of like dry, hollow version of the bass line is just running alone, sort of, for the end. I mean, there are those kind of like noise artifacts and stuff that some of the listeners pointed out. But it feels like it starts one place, it finishes one place. Actually, I remember, you know, when we talked about XI, we had kind of a similar feeling where a lot of these things are supposed to be jams, and yet they actually feel like quite coherent little, you know, we start at A and we end at B, you know?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like this, I think feels pretty composed. I would love to hear like what it's edited down from, you know, like is this just like the end chunk of it, you know, or are we putting different chunks together? Because really, yeah, it doesn't actually feel like jammy. I mean, like I said at the beginning, the only reason I said that is because I knew we were gonna say the opposite here in 30 seconds.
I know. Yeah. It's just so like, I don't know. I would love to hear that. I would be so curious to hear that, but it does seem like, I mean, that's what good editing would do. Like you would edit down jams and it wouldn't sound like jams anymore. But I feel like after this period, they actually get more interested in capturing a little bit more of the jamming
of its.
And as we talked about, like, you know, that the one track on XI that really does that, I think, is like Cloudline, which does keep some of the, like, it has like a slower start than some of these. But all right, we can move into track 2. which is called M39 Defain. AE Pages had this to say: in an interview with The Quietist, Rob explained that much of M39 Defain was mostly constructed out of found sounds, rain, New York, bits of city life, bits of weather, direct recordings of rain on certain objects mic'd up. Listener Jackson had this to say: it took a few listens for me to notice how creepy this one is if you just focus on the background ambience. Sometimes I hear what almost sounds like high-pitched violins doing an atonal horror score, but really quiet and reverbed out. The way that contrasts with the goofy nasally vibrato toms is so absurd, and it reminds me of how RDJ would contrast creepy with funny a lot.
EBCD says, this might be my favorite track on the record, but it's also so disappointing to listen to. What I mean is, the first minute or two is the most hype shit ever, then it just goes nowhere. Once the bass comes in, you might think it's like a breakdown before the track builds itself back up and gets back to the good stuff, and instead the track proceeds to just meander around for the next 3 or 4 minutes before it ends without much climax. What keeps me interested regardless has to be the sound design. AE Pages quotes Rob saying that a lot of the individual sounds in this track were made out of samples and found sounds, and I think that it comes across in how textured and organic a lot of this track feels. I also have to mention the cowbell because I love it, and hearing a cowbell feels like a rare treat in an Autechre track. I remember in the initial podcast, the bass was compared to bubbling lava, which I still think is a really good comparison.
Listener Sunil said, this one is a lot more minimal. It does very little for me, honestly. I like a lot of the sound design, but then there's also sounds I find annoying. The sparse atmospheric quality reminds me of Space's How V a little bit. I think that's like 5, I think.
Tyler says, bubbling, stumbling, and doesn't really feel like it goes anywhere.
And finally, listener Marcy says, makes me think of a tropical sandy beach with palm trees. It's weird because it's rare that I get such a vivid image of something when I listen to Autechre, but this track hasn't failed to make me think of a beach every single time I hear it. That is, you might be on your own with that one. I don't know if I hear a beach. And actually, it's interesting because on that half jokey thing that Sean said, he said track 4 should be listened to on the beach. Not that that necessarily means it sounds like the beach, but anyway, interesting to know. What do you think about this one?
This one's cool. I really love the sound design in it. Like there's just so many things to like focus in on and notice throughout listening to this. Especially this was one of the like good things about focusing in on these small EPs and stuff. Like I don't think I've ever spent like that much time just looking into it, and then with the knowledge of like these mic'd up water sounds, like I feel like right at the beginning of the track, like way deep in the mix, like if you listen, it's like, and that it's like, oh yeah, that was obviously like a very closely mic'd, like a water droplet or something. And that's just so cool. I love like the there's just those like big bass pounding sounds with like that. I think it's supposed to be a snare. Maybe it's the cowbell. That's like real pingy, metallic sounding. But then there's like kind of a regular snare hidden behind it that gives you like the sense of what it's doing in the beat. You got like woodblock sounds that are throughout that are really cool. It's like that woodblock sound. I think it's just like in Autechre, we, especially nowadays, don't get like these sounds that are like so recognizable as like a physical object, like that.
Yeah, it makes this one special. I think it's really cool to just listen to. It has that quality of like, I forget who said it up front, but almost Confield-esque, where it's like, yeah, the composition is not as important as, the sound design, like the sound world they've created. And yeah, I gotta say, this track is quite nicely composed, which like, I don't know, I don't think it's appreciated enough because it again has kind of an A part and a B part. The A part is that like kind of clanging, start stop thing. And then the B part is kind of like a different pattern that is more of like this kind of wubbing, sound. Again, it has a start-stop quality, but it's like a different configuration. Both sounds, I think, really emphasize like the empty space a lot, so you get to hear like this kind of oozing, like almost distortion underneath. There's sometimes, now I'm wondering if it's like actually literally it could be, but it sounds like soda fizzing or something like that. It has that kind of sound. Lots of play with the empty space there. And then what happens is we get this kind of like creeping, like kind of high plinky pattern joins on the top. I forget which listener it was who said like it doesn't go anywhere, but I just totally disagree, because we get this like new kind of not quite melodic, but this like kind of plinking pattern. And then we basically reach the point where now all parts are playing together. The A part with the clacking and the clanging, the B part with like the wubbing bass, and then that honestly like kind of a C part or C element with this like this high thing kind of descending down. And again, it feels like it's a very abstract version, but it's like classic AE track construction, and it really it nails it for like something that you would kind of think initially of as just like an assemblage of sounds,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another reason I think it works better if it had come out before XI. We talked about like XI being like kind of this starting point for like the current day Autechre, and like they're sort of playing with those sounds in a way that's familiar with the old Autechre composition style. So I think that those. It's like a good middle point between those two things.
Yeah. And again, I feel like it really came out for me because I've been like obsessing over the Shane Parrish record, which really like, brings to the fore how they used to kind of compose the tracks. And so it's just kind of cool to like, I would not have thought before this week. I don't think I would have noticed that, but then I was like, oh yeah, that is like kind of how they would kind of like swirl everything together. All right. We can move on to track 3, Oslo for N. This is the one that a lot of people had something to say about. AE Pages first, though, has this note to say, Sean kept the technicalities of the Formant synthesis, I don't even know what words are coming out of my mouth, type of sounds under wraps, saying it was some other weird method. However, he did note that the source was white noise. So interesting that we kind of shift from the previous track was like really composed with a lot of sampling, and this is more of like the pure max experience of just starting with white noise. From an Ask Autechre Anything, Sean had this to say: Oslo for N was made at night. Do with that what you will. And then also somebody had asked this, which is like such a funny thing to ask them. On the Ask Autechre Anything, somebody had said, do you guys like Oslo for N a lot? I don't understand how it fits into Elevent at all. And Sean said, it's like when there's a word in a sentence that you don't recognize. What do you make of that comment?
Kind of like
cryptic comment.
Like formant synthesis.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that is a cryptic comment. I wonder if he's just kind of joking, or something. I think it fits in with XI decently well, or I mean, Elevent rather. So I don't fully get that, but it's kind of a jerk off question. So I'll give a jerk off answer. Yeah,
it's like, do you guys actually like this? But it does feel like this crazy wrench that gets thrown into this thing, which a lot of our listeners had something to say about. Listener Tyler said, Oslo for N has a lo-fi percussion line in the forefront that feels generative and loses its appeal less than halfway through the track. Very little else, and the track evolves.
So Neil says, this one is fascinating. It feels initially like being in a dark, remote location where something is frantically trying to break into or out of something, scraping and drilling. Halfway through, the sounds form a more coherent rhythm while becoming smaller and less ominous, and it feels like we zoom out into a wider scene. It's very creepy, but also beautiful.
Jackson said, my fave by far. The main coughing sound hits in all the wrong places in a way that is just so incredibly satisfying. The hats looping in 5 is so great too. This track has, in particular, ties Elevent to XI, and that it sounds a lot like Vecco S. I really agree, especially when the cough starts glitching its way into a more regular beat. This track really reminds me of 2022 Dash, and in particular sets D and E, in the way you have some musical or percussive thing going on, and then just a bunch of glitchy, swishing noise smeared on top of it haphazardly, sort of blocking it out.
EBCD says, an immediately outstanding track just for how bizarre it is. It has more in common with some sort of avant-garde composition than it does with any hip-hop or techno music I've ever heard. The rhythm feels totally erratic and indecipherable for most of the track, although at some point it shifts into something a bit more steady and remains there for the rest of the track. Of course, that's not even mentioning the literal sound of it, as the track hinges almost entirely on the dry coughing noise that sputters around for its entire runtime. It makes this track kind of hard to want to come back to, as I can't say I ever find myself thinking I could really go for more of whatever that noise in Oslo for N is. But I can at least say I do enjoy the track while it's on, as pretty much every time it feels like I'm rediscovering everything else that the track has to offer past its most defining characteristic.
Listener Rob says, Oslo for N could slip into one of the NTS sessions, and I would feel it would be right at home.
Marcy says, the coughing snare sound is a very uniquely XI sound. This would fit perfectly on the album. It's the most relatable AE song for me because I'm also coughing all the time.
You should get that checked out. Yeah, I mean, this one, I think, I don't know. It was funny because I always have mixed feelings about this one. I sort of agree with, well, it was like some of the listeners said, there's not a lot beyond this kind of weird coughing sound to really even focus on. And yeah, the empty space is really a huge part of this. And yet, you know, some of the other listeners felt like there is something interesting to sort of dig deep in. I guess I'm somewhere like in the middle, in the sense that it has this kind of, there isn't a whole lot there. And yeah, I'm really fascinated by the way that I forget who put it, but who said like the rhythm is very erratic at first and then eventually kind of locks into something steadier. It has this kind of like, it locks into this very interesting kind of jazzy pattern. Like there's just this lone hat kind of keeping time alongside this coughing thing. And at first it is like so, you know, just inexplicable. Like what, like I can't even figure out like what is the hat doing? You know, it doesn't make sense. And of course the kick as well feels like quite haphazard, but as it sort of slowly locks into place, the hat now has this very classic, like kind of jazzy pattern to it, which is like very unique, I think, for Autechre. And I find the last half of this track quite groovy. The cough actually gets like kind of clipped shorter and shorter. And actually that hat gets, you know, almost tighter and tighter and higher until it almost feels like these little micro fragments. Honestly, it reminded me of our discussion of the field last week as well. You know, but it just has this cool arc. This is the one track on the record that I feel actually does sound jammed, because it sounds like something that over the course of the 8 minutes, they kind of find it. And then I love it when they find it.
Yeah, I totally see that. You know, like I like that a lot about this track. You know, it starts off just with, you know, that cough. The hat, I think it's like so kind of low in the mix, even, you know, that like at first glance or listen, I guess, like, oh, it's hard to even like notice it over that cough. And so, you know, like that cough like draws your attention so much that you just like, you miss the forest for the trees sort of thing. I you know, at the end, the second half, whatever, like when those like big laser blasts are coming in and sound all digitally glitched out and everything, like I
kind
really
of a nice
like
preview for Newbound, which has a lot of those like zapping laser sounds.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is like maybe one of the songs that would fit into XI as much. I think in the context of XI, it would maybe have like, you know, it'd probably be one of those tracks that we think of as like being, you know, kind of the White Album, you know, hodgepodge kind of thing. Like maybe not something you would want to listen to just on its own, but like it in the whole thing. But I think it works great here, even on this short EP, to like give you a little bit of a taste of that. And I you know, I like it. I think this is like the one that when I first got into Elevent and stuff, you know, like this is the one that sort of like drew my attention the most. You know, because of that, such a weird, you know, that cough. It's just like it reminds me of like General Grievous, you know, like from Star Wars, like like a half robot that for some reason is always coughing, kind of thing. Yeah, so I don't know. It's like such an interesting sound, but then like, you know, there's also other stuff. You know, it like really, I think it's a perfect example of like Autechre's maybe not everything that you've catch on first glance is all that's there,
Yeah, another thing I find really weird is that there's kind of like running through the whole track is like a buzzing that it sounds like when a cable is not plugged in all the way, It's just kind of like making this buzzing sound. And then actually toward the end, it starts to sort of like change tones, like sort of subtly underneath. It's like approaching music, but just one tiny little micro step toward, something musical. There's also quite ghostly kind of like ringing, reminds me of like when you drag your, finger over like a crystal glass kind of a thing underneath, which I think is kind of cool and eerie. But and I'm glad you mentioned like the lasers apps, because I feel like that makes it like kind of a nice, it kind of shifts right into Newbound. It's interesting because I could see this being on XI, like you just said. It would definitely stand out, but in kind of like a White Album way, in the sense that like almost everything feels like it stands out on that record. But when you put it on this short form EP, instead of just being like this weird offshoot, it now feels like a centerpiece of the whole thing. Yeah. And I think that I don't know, for me, it was like, this was like the last track that I got into, because I think that's really strange. It's like, does it bother you that this is the longest track, or you like that?
I think like at first it's maybe a bit of like an endurance test of like how long you can deal with that one kind of sound. But I whatever listener said, it kind of reminds them of like avant-garde composition and stuff. Like I like that kind of thing, so it's sort of at home in that world, and has always like reminded me of it. So I do like it, and I don't mind the length at all.
Well, we move into track 4, which I already sort of mentioned, Newbound. I wanted to quote this. Actually, I forgot to mention, because it was listener Joe, like you said earlier, who, I guess was just procrastinating and ended up totally redoing the Wikipedia for this EP. So I'm going to link that in the show notes, because you should check it out. It was funny because I was like, literally, I just like went to the EP or the Wikipedia. I was like, I don't remember this being so detailed, and then come to find out it was like one of our listeners who expanded it. But this is something that Joe added to the Wikipedia page. It says, Rob called this track more straight-laced compared to the first 3 tracks, and expressed how he enjoyed that others had compared it with the style of the group's early work. Very interesting. To get the listeners on the table, listener EBCD said, I wouldn't be surprised if Newbound was made very early during the sessions for XI, as it sounds like a dead ringer for Move of 10. The shimmery and lush, vaguely analog lead synth combined with the jagged and sputtering drums. Plus, it's much more melody-focused and colorful compared to XI. I think the track has some really nice harmonies that are beautifully accented by the ghostly pads underneath. If I have any complaint, it's that I feel the track could have been cut down by a minute or two, as I do think a decent chunk of the track's runtime is spent just meandering around. It's also a strange closing track, given its lack of progression and how it practically ends with a hard cut to silence, although maybe this could be reinforcing the idea that this EP is just a smaller part of a bigger piece rather than its own separate thing.
Jackson says, I like the whistly sounds that come in out of nowhere occasionally. Love when Autechre do that sort of thing. Makes the track feel alive. I also like how the track ends by just ending.
Listener Sunil says, I wouldn't call this a great track in isolation, but I think it works well as a closer for Elevent. Its prettiness hits nicely after the tracks that preceded it.
Tyler says, follows in the footsteps of the closers on Overstep and XI, with plonking, distorted, melodic sense degrading a la William Basinski. But it ends up feeling like a less interesting version of both of the aforementioned tracks, and far less climatic and dramatic. The end of the EP feels sudden and unsatisfying, with Newbound fizzling out and abruptly halting.
Listener Rob says, Newbound has that upbeat vibe that starts set D of 2022 Dash. I would be thrilled if an AE show started with this track. That being said, once that upbeat vibe fades out, I find the track fairly slight by the standards of AE's 2013 output. Is it good? Sure. Is it memorable? That's arguable. And I want to read the last one because I don't feel like you're going to do it justice. This is from listener Marcy, who says, Newbound is 100% a cat because it goes meow, 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 meow bound. Plus, it's very pretty. I can kind of hear that now that you mentioned. I like how somebody compared the first track to like ripping ass. This one to meowing. That's the kind of thing we spend all of our time listening to. So what do you think about this track, Newbound?
Yeah, this one, I get what a lot of the listeners are saying. I like it. I think it works well here on Elevent. I think it like that analog-ish synth that someone mentioned. I think it's like very, kind of like a Boards of Canada feeling synth. But like the percussion is like, firmly AE, kind of thing. So I think it's sort of interesting in that sense that we get like those two worlds kind of mixed together. This track, the way it ends, it does sort of like lead a little credence to like, is this part of a larger thing, but I think also too, if it works as like a prologue sort of thing, like maybe that it's like a cliff hanger ending, sort of thing. So I think it can work either way.
Yeah, I kind of love this track. I mean, it's interesting because I feel like everybody compares it to YJY at the end of XI, and it doesn't stand up to that. But it's like, do we have to? Like, why do we have to compare it to? It's just like the other kind of pretty oversteps-esque thing from these sessions. It's got these kind of laser zaps, like we were talking about, like the kind of main percussive rhythm is like these zaps. There are these, laser sounding, like descending synth lines, which are really like beautiful, and the way they kind of layer over the top of each other. And then you've got this kind of these like heavenly tones just sort of hanging over the top, like kind of shimmering. Really reminds me of Blade Low Res, actually, the way that has those, because there are some tracks where they have like just kind of these ghostly tones hanging there and it adds to the uneasiness, and other times where they just kind of make it actually something very pretty, very heavenly. And, Blade Low Res is one example, right? So it kind of reminds me of that. And when you do try to add this to XI, it makes this track, I think, kind of a cool preview for Blade Low Res. In fact, I think those, the way those kind of things are like sort of shimmering and glitching a little bit really reminds me of that. But my favorite part about this track is like that kind of cascading, like just descending sort of laser synth sounds, very pretty. Eventually it gets like sped up, it starts going like kind of faster and becomes more like, instead of these kind of gracefully, majestic descending lines, it's like these little ripples or these little flickers of melody. And eventually it gets so fast that for the end of the track, it's just like single bursts of sound. And it kind of gives me like this cool, like Ouroboros effect where it's like, okay, if we just kept listening to this, like if it didn't get cut off, it would eventually go back, like it would eventually speed up and become the original pattern again, and then it would speed up again so much that it became just a single sound. You kind of get what I'm saying? Like, yeah, it almost feels like it speeds up so much that it's actually now slower.
Yeah, no, I get you. Yeah, totally. This is sort of like a thing that could go on. One of the listeners complained about the length a bit, and yeah, I agree. It could go on and on, like in this sort of looping way.
It is steadier than like honestly anything here and anything on XI, in the sense that I don't think that like central rhythm really shifts much at all. It just is kind of
definitely
like locked in and going. So I can get why that's like, if you're in an XI mood, maybe it doesn't like hit the way that a lot of these more evolving type sounds does, but it makes for a nice conclusion for sure, I think. So now that we've gone through the 4 tracks of this EP, anything change in your overall thoughts now that we've talked through it? Anything to add about this EP's relationship with stuff that came after, especially 2022 Dash?
No, not really. I mean, I think it was just like really nice to focus in on these EPs that so often get kind of overlooked, just because you always tie them in with whatever record they came out around. And so I think my main takeaway really is that like I think we should continue to do the EPs this way, and LSEC, everything like we said. Like it's really nice to like granularly look at it.
Yeah, I think that honestly, I've always liked this, and then giving it like a full week's attention, I like it even more. I think it holds up. I've just decided, like, I was always kind of on the fence about this, but I did decide this week that I don't think it belongs in XI. I don't really like this anymore, like trying to add it. But I think it holds up on its own and works really well on its own. I also kind of like a new, eureka moment this week was just thinking of this a little bit more as like a prototype of XI rather than, like a little extra or something. I think it's actually useful to think of it that way because it does kind of sound like it should have come out first. I was going to ask, in case that didn't come up, about why they wanted to have it come out first. But I wanted to read this from listener Rob, who said, the fact that Sean and Rob wanted to release this first and that Warp, upon hearing both, insisted on releasing Elevent second by several months tells me that sometimes you need an outside perspective on occasion in order to save you from yourself. Yeah, interesting. I mean, what do you think like Warp heard and decided this needs to come second?
I don't know. That anytime we like talk about like, Warp wanted this or whatnot, it's just so weird that I don't know why, but I always just sort of assumed like a label like this was kind of just letting them do whatever they wanted. So it's sort of weird to hear that. I don't know, because I mean I think like we've determined I don't think that it fits inside of XI, and I think it works better, as a preview to it. So I'm really not sure because, like I said, if it's sort of like a middle point of this like new Techer thing, when you put it after, like it feels like maybe not a step back, but like, it's not a step forward or anything. So I don't know. It's very odd, unless like it's purely a sales thing. Like maybe they think if people buy Elevent, then they won't want to buy a box set in a couple months. I don't know.
Yeah, ultimately, I mean, I think they were right. I think that when you hear XI, it blows you away. I mean, that's how we felt. That's how everybody, almost everybody, not everybody, but almost everybody who wrote in about this, about XI last week, that's how they felt. So ultimately, they were right. They're like, okay, let's share this with the world first. But it's like at the expense of Elevent, I think. And I don't know. In retrospect, I feel like people should maybe give it a try. Like when you get in an XI mood, put on Elevent as a little sampler plate and then jump into XI if you got 2.5 hours to kill, and see how that plays. Just to wrap up, we had one more sort of write-in from Joe, who said, if I remember correctly, you guys said you were planning on ranking the 5 XI/Elevent discs in terms of how well they worked as separate standalone EPs. Here's my ranking. Number 1, Elevent, not surprising since at the end of the day it was released this way, intended to stand on its own. Number 2, XI1. I totally agree with your guys' assessment last time, pointing out that it worked well. It feels a bit more substantial with 5 tracks, even though it's basically the same length as the others. Yeah, I guess I didn't really realize that's like the one EP, quote unquote, with 5 tracks.
Yeah.
Number 3, XI4. Cloudline works well as an opening track, and obviously YJY is a GOAT closer. Number 4, this is getting confusing. XI3, I feel like this would almost work if the track order was reversed. That's a good goddamn comment, honestly. I didn't even think about that, but if you flipped, because it goes like 1-1 is to, what is it? 1-1 is to SPL9. If you flip that, it would actually do like an Elevent type thing where it would go from crazy abrasive to, something more melodic and pretty. That might actually work really well. But then finally, Joe put XI2 last, saying, I can no longer hear this in any other way than the 3 tracks before Blade Low Res, as Gabe called it. I agree. That one works the least, that is the least successful as like any attempt to stand on its own. I think we agreed that we kind of thought of it as like the Blade Low Res single in a way. So yeah, I would definitely put that last. I would definitely put Elevent first because I think it really like tells a kind of a coherent story. Yeah, I might even be like on the exact same page. It's just that I sort of think that the last EP, XI4, which would go from Cloudline to YJY, I really like that one as well because it has that kind of cool hip hop identity a little bit. But I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think Elevent is the obvious, number one because it was released that way. Yeah, I hate to just agree with Joe, but yeah, I wouldn't really argue. I think 1, 4, 3, 2 is maybe a good way to go.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna probably kind of stick with it. I might put XI4 before XI1, but
I wouldn't argue with you. Yeah.
Yeah, you're really onto something, Joe, though, with the idea that like if you flip the running order of XI3, it might be like as cohesive as Elevent in a weird way. I want to test that now. All right, that's Elevent. Should we wrap up with some new music recommendations?
Yeah, let's do it. All right, my rec this week is Rafael, Anton, Irisarri, I think is how you say it. His new record, Points of Inaccessibility. This is a great like ambient drone with some post-rock qualities, strings, a little bit of guitar sounds. Reminds me of like some really specific moments in like Godspeed You Black Emperor, especially Skinny Fists, which is one of my favorite records. I've never heard of Rafael before. I just saw this, checked it out, and it's really awesome. I got to dig more into his catalog. Interesting.
I've never even heard of that. I wanted to shout out, so Speedy J, who is, I'm trying to think. I guess he's a Warp artist. I know he was on that original Artificial Intelligence compilation. I mentioned that I was kind of in a techno mood after our field episode, and so I was listening to a little Speedy J, and then I saw that he had put out 2 EPs so far this year as part of this project, which is really kind of interesting. It's like they're called STOOR Soundchecks. So there's STOOR Soundcheck 1 and STOOR Soundcheck 2, and I guess he's been doing these shows. I need to read a little more about it, but he's been doing these like collaborative jammed shows with like other artists where it's like a very simple setup and they're like kind of jamming in real time, like improvising together. And there's some like kind of quality in which they can actually affect each other's sounds. And so there's kind of like this trusting thing. It sounds sort of an interesting live occasion. But he said that he basically just records everything, including his own like sound checks before these shows. And it really, I don't know, that makes it sound bad, but it is really interesting because it's almost like, it's like less musical and more of like a, system workout or something, or like an effects workout. Sometimes like I feel this way about Autechre. Sometimes I feel this way about Pansonic, where it's like less a musical track and more of like a stress test for my system, I find it kind of cool to like listen to these. They sound really good and like really almost like non-musical in an interesting way. It's still this like kind of propulsive techno rhythm, but it just feels like a bit of a stress test or something. I'm finding it very, very interesting. I'm glad he released these, so I recommend it.
Nice. I'll have to check that out. Well, next time we got an interview with Shade Parrish on Autechre Guitar. So subscribe over at patreon.com/GONKCAST. Share your thoughts via Patreon or email gonkcastpod@gmail.com. If you like the show, help us out. Tell a friend. Leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. And follow us on social media. All that's at GONKCASTpod. And we'll see you next time.
See ya.